In the spring of 1285, the Mongol Empire, conqueror of nations, feared across continents, seemed unstoppable. Their banners already flew above the walls of Thanglang, today's Hanoi. But on the Red River, at a narrow crossing called Hàm Tử, destiny waited. Here, a desperate kingdom would turn water into fire, silence into thunder, and the world's most feared army into prey. What happened on that river would shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility, ignite a counteroffensive, and decide whether Đại Việt would be erased from history or rise to defy the greatest empire the world had ever known. The year was 1285. Across Asia, the Mongol Empire of Kublai Khan stretched like a thundercloud. From the steppes of Mongolia to the rivers of China, from the deserts of Central Asia to the shores of Korea, the empire demanded tribute and obedience. To Kublai Khan, Đại Việt, what we know today as Vietnam, was a small but vital kingdom along the road to further conquest. Its rice fields, its rivers, and its ports could feed his armies and open the way into the wealthy lands of Southeast Asia. But there was more. 3 years earlier, in 1282, the Tran dynasty of Đại Việt had refused Kublai's demands to provide troops for an invasion of Champa, the southern kingdom. To the great Khan, this defiance was intolerable. He had conquered empires larger than Đại Việt. He would not allow a small kingdom on the edge of his realm to defy his order. And so he prepared a second invasion, greater and more terrible than the first attempt of 1258. In the spring of 1285, Prince Togan, known to the Vietnamese as Thoat Hoan, led the new campaign. Tens of thousands of Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, and allied auxiliaries marched south. From the northern passes of China, they poured into the Red River Delta. From the sea, UN fleets arrived, carrying reinforcements and supplies. Soon the banners of the empire rose above the walls of Thăng Long, today's Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam. To the ordinary eye, it seemed that Đại Việt had fallen. Villages were burned, fields seized, river docks filled with enemy ships. Mongol horsemen galloped down highways, their hooves scattering dust across abandoned rice paddies. Within weeks, the capital was occupied, and the UN armies proclaimed victory. But the Tran dynasty knew the truth. They had faced the Mongols before. They understood that no kingdom in Asia could survive the storm of Mongol cavalry in a single battle on open ground. To fight head-on was to invite destruction, and so the court chose a different path. Rather than defending the capital at all costs, they withdrew deliberately to Thiên Trong and Truong Yen, riverland strongholds south of Thăng Long. The strategy was ancient, yet deadly. The scorched earth, the empty house. Villages were evacuated. Granaries were burned. Bridges and supply depots were destroyed. Everywhere the UN armies advanced, they found silence. They found ashes. This was not weakness. It was a trap stretched across the land. The invaders might occupy castles and streets, but they could not feed an army on ruins. Every day they advanced, their supply lines stretched thinner. Every step forward cut them deeper into the swampy heart of the Red River Delta, where hunger, disease, and ambush awaited. At the heart of this resistance stood two men, Tran Quang Khai, a high-ranking statesman and general whose calm mind balanced military power with political resolve, and beside him, Prince Tran Nhat Duat, a royal commander famed for his diplomacy and mastery of foreign languages. Both men understood that survival meant patience. They would give up the shell of the capital to preserve the living core of the nation. They would wait until the Mongols grew weary, stretched, and vulnerable. Then from the rivers, from the marshes, from the forests, Đại Việt would strike back. And the place chosen for that counterstroke was Hàm Tử, a narrow choke point in the Red River, near today's Co Ai Chau in northern Vietnam. Whoever held Hàm Tử would decide where the war would flow next. Holding Thăng Long gave the UN army little comfort. The capital was deserted, its storehouses burned, its people gone. The victory was an empty shell. Each day the invaders marched deeper, their supply lines stretched thinner, their soldiers hungrier. If they could not secure food and transport, their conquest would wither in its cradle. For the UN commanders, the answer was the rivers. The Red River was the artery of Đại Việt, carrying grain, reinforcements, and weapons from the northern frontier deep into the heart of the delta. Without it, the Mongol army could not live. And on that river stood a narrow choke point called Hàm Tử, near today's Coi Chau in northern Vietnam. Whoever commanded this crossing could decide the fate of the entire war. If the UN held Hàm Tử, they could reopen their supply routes, sever the Tran Court's retreat, and march south to end resistance once and for all. To them, Hàm Tử was not just a ford, it was the key to controlling Đại Việt. That was why, in the spring of 1285, their fleet advanced down the Red River. The Tran commanders knew this, and so, long before the first yuan oar touched the water, they had turned Hàm Tử into a trap. The river itself became their weapon. Its shallow sandbars shifted like ghosts, its deep currents twisted like coiled serpents. To the untrained eye, it was only water. To Đại Việt, it was a battlefield waiting to be unleashed. Carpenters, fishermen, and soldiers worked by night. Fire rafts, chained and soaked with tar, were disguised under reeds so they looked harmless. Small sampans were fitted for speed, carrying archers and javelin throwers who could strike and vanish. Larger war junks hid downstream, their oars muffled, their hulls tarred to glide in silence. Scouts marked sandbars, measured tides, and listened for the slap of foreign oars. At the heart of the plan stood Prince Tran Nhat Duat, the diplomat turned commander, who bound together imperial troops, militias, and even river raiders into one united force. Beside him was Tran Quang Khai, the statesman general, whose calm resolve gave soldiers courage. Together they shaped Hàm Tử into a killing ground disguised as calm water. The Yuan invaders believed they were opening a door. In truth, they were stepping into the jaws of a trap. The UN fleet advanced down the Red River with confidence. After securing Thăng Long, they believed the kingdom of Đại Việt was already broken. Hàm Tử, to their commanders, was simply another crossing, one more step in tightening their hold. But they did not see what lay ahead. The Tran Court had prepared the river itself to become a weapon. As dawn broke, the first UN ships entered the narrow bend. The water seemed calm, the banks silent, but hidden in the reeds, eyes watched, bows drawn tight. Suddenly, shadows rose from the mist. Arrows hissed through the air, raining down in volleys that struck sails, pierced armor, and cut down helmsmen. From low sampans hidden along the waterline, Vietnamese archers released storm after storm of shafts. Confusion rippled through the Yuan ranks. Soldiers scrambled to return fire, but their arrows fell short, their vision blurred by fog and smoke. Before the enemy could recover, the second strike came. From upstream, the current carried chained rafts, drifting lazily at first. The UN sailors shouted in derision, until sparks leapt, tar ignited, and fire engulfed the wooden monsters. The rafts struck hulls with crushing force, setting ships ablaze. Flames climbed the rigging, sails collapsed in fire, and panic spread like wildfire across the fleet. Sailors hacked at chains, shoved the burning rafts back into the current, but the river betrayed them, pushing the fire deeper into their formation. The roar of battle grew louder. Smoke thickened, blotting out the morning sun. In the chaos, the third blow was unleashed. From downstream, war junks surged forward, their oars muffled until now. Their iron prows rammed into burning ships, and from their decks leapt warriors armed with spears and swords. They boarded UN vessels in sudden fury, fighting hand-to-hand across decks slick with blood and water. The clash was brutal. Shouts, steel, and screams mingled with the crackle of fire. The strategy was genius, not only in its design, but in its timing. First came confusion, then terror, then annihilation. Each wave struck at the perfect moment, giving the enemy no chance to regain order. The Mongols, unmatched in open plains, were powerless here. Their cavalry, their greatest weapon, was useless on the river. Formations dissolved into chaos. Commanders shouted orders no one could hear above the roar of fire and battle. In the midst of it all, Prince Trannat Duat directed with calm precision, signaling when to release the fire rafts, ensuring they struck the center of the UN line. Tran Quang Kai, from his command junk, steadied his men and urged them forward, transforming fury into disciplined strikes. Together, they orchestrated the destruction like conductors of war. By midday, Hàm Tử was an inferno. The Red River was choked with wreckage, masts burning like torches, hulls splintered and half sunk, bodies drifting among the flames. The cries of drowning soldiers echoed through the smoke, and above it all, the triumphant shouts of Đại Viet's warriors rose. The Battle of Hàm Tử was not only a military victory, it was a revelation. For the first time, the Mongols, the terror of the known world, had been beaten decisively in a naval battle. And with this victory, the tide of the war began to turn. The Red River still smoked with wreckage when word of victory spread. Across the delta, from villages hidden in the reeds to hamlets clinging to dikes, the news raced like wildfire. The invincible Mongols had been beaten. At Hàm Tử, the Tran dynasty had done what the world thought impossible. For months, the people of Đại Việt had endured silence and ashes. They had abandoned their homes, burned their stores, and watched foreign banners rise over their capital. But Hàm Tử changed everything. It proved that the empire of Kublai Khan could bleed. It proved that patience and cunning could outwit numbers and power. Most of all, it gave the people hope. Hope that resistance was not only possible, but destined. The court seized the moment. Orders were sent out from the hidden command centers in Tien Truong and Truong Yen. Militia units were summoned from the mountains. Guerrilla bands once scattered were brought into the fold. And on the rivers, more traps were prepared. Hàm Tử was not to be an isolated victory. It was the first drumbeat of a campaign of counterattack. The Mongols knew it too. Their defeat at Hàm Tử shattered the illusion of inevitability. To secure their hold, they would need more victories, but now they faced a foe who had tasted triumph. Every village became a fortress. Every canal became an ambush. And every day their supplies dwindled. For the Tran commanders, the next targets were clear. Downriver lay Trong Duong, another crossing where the UN fleet would attempt to regroup. Beyond that was Tai Ket, where the invaders hoped to consolidate their hold. The victories at Hàm Tử had not ended the war, but they had opened the gate to push the enemy back. In the eyes of the people, the tide had turned. The war was no longer about survival alone. It was about reclaiming their land, their capital, their honor. And from that moment on, the Tran dynasty would no longer fight in retreat. They would fight forward. The victory at Hàm Tử was only the beginning. It was like a spark in dry grass, spreading fire across the entire land. For months, the people of Đại Việt had endured hunger, ashes, and exile. Now the smoke of Mongol ships burning on the Red River gave them something new: belief. If the invaders could bleed, they could be beaten. And with that belief, the Tran commanders moved swiftly. The time for retreat was over. The time for the counterattack had come. Their next target was Trong Duong, another critical crossing on the Red River. Here, the remnants of the Yuan fleet gathered, desperate to regroup after their humiliation at Hàm Tử. Their commanders lined ships along the banks, anchoring them in tight formation. They built makeshift defenses, hoping to buy time and secure supplies. But fear was already eating into their ranks. Sailors whispered of fire rafts and ghostly ambushes in the reeds. The invincible aura of the Mongols had cracked. The Tran generals struck with ruthless precision. Just as at Hàm Tử, the river itself became the weapon. Hidden fire ships, prepared upriver, were released with the tide. They drifted silently until the current drove them into the heart of the UN line. Suddenly, sails caught fire, hulls split, men leapt screaming into the water. From the banks, volleys of arrows darkened the sky. And then, at the height of panic, Tran war junks rammed into the chaos, unleashing warriors who fought with ferocity born from months of sacrifice. The battle was swift, savage, and final. By the end of the day, Chuangduang was a graveyard of shattered ships. The Red River once again belonged to Đại Việt, but the Tran commanders knew momentum was everything. Before the Mongols could recover, they pressed to Tai Ket, the last stronghold where the invaders hoped to consolidate their battered forces. Here the UN had fortified stockades, massed infantry, and drawn their remaining ships into a defensive wall. It was their last chance to hold the delta. The Battle of Tai Ket was unlike the quick ambushes before. It was a grinding struggle, fought by land and water alike. On the river, Tran warships battered Yuan vessels, setting many ablaze. On the banks, militias and imperial soldiers stormed fortifications again and again, clashing with disciplined enemy lines. The fighting raged through the day, smoke and dust rising as if the earth itself were at war. The Mongols fought with ferocity. They knew that defeat here meant disaster. But the Vietnamese pressed harder, their ranks swelling with peasants and fighters who had returned after Hàm Tử and Chuangduang. At last, the walls of Tai Ket cracked. The UN lines buckled. Their generals fled north in haste, abandoning supplies and men alike. The once mighty fleet that had descended the Red River in triumph now broke apart in panic. Ships scattered, soldiers drowning, commanders disgraced. The chain was complete. Hàm Tử, Chuangduang, Tai Ket. 3 victories that transformed despair into triumph, that turned defense into offense, that broke the spine of the Mongol invasion. For the people of Đại Việt, these were not just battles, they were liberation. Farmers reclaimed their fields. Families returned to their villages. Bells rang in temples, not for mourning, but for joy. The rivers that had carried fear now carried songs of victory. And yet everyone knew the war was not over. The Mongols were relentless. They would come again. But after 1285, they no longer came as untouchable conquerors. They came knowing that on the waters of Đại Việt, they could be beaten.